Please can you welcome up Roger Tattersall.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch and a good chat. I'm here to help keep you awake for the rest of the afternoon. I'm going to try and keep you interested. And David's told me I've got a bit longer than I was originally told I'd have. So I'm going to be able to throw in a bit of amusing anecdote as well to add a little bit of humour to what I've got to say, because just talking about science can get a bit dry. You tend to see people nodding off at the back. So I'm going to try and prevent that happening. A, because I've got a loud voice, and B, I'll tell you some funny stories too. So we've got some slides coming up in a couple of moments, and then we can get things underway. So, I've got a clicker. It's up to me to get it started. So I chose this animation for the opening screen because, in a way, there's a kind of irony here. The cooling towers have been used as a kind of icon for the climate change activists to say, look at all the pollution that we're throwing up into the sky. Now, a lot of you know that isn't smoke that's coming out there. That's water vapor, condensing water vapor. In fact, they're man-made clouds. And we'll see a little further on in my talk how clouds are actually very, very important to the climate issue and very poorly understood. And when you actually put the climate scientists under pressure, they admit that clouds are where the biggest uncertainty is in their models. But I'll come back to that in a while. But I just want to say a few words about myself, because I'm actually going to challenge the science in this talk. When a lot of the people who are against the idea that there's a climate crisis and against things like ULEZ and all these policies which are being brought down on us that restrict our freedom and make life worse for us and are going to impoverish us with net zero's costs, they challenge the policy, but they don't try to fight on two fronts. So they don't challenge the science, and they say, oh well, we think maybe the basic science is right, but it's been over-egged or it's been exaggerated, and the policies are too stringent, and not needed in the sort of force that they're being applied. Now, I'm actually going to take the bull by the horns, and I'm going to challenge the science. I think they've got the science basically wrong, and if we can show that, then we can actually cut the whole debate off at the knees, and all of the ULEZ and all of the net zero and everything else just falls away, because it's all predicated on this idea that our emissions are causing a change in the world's climate and causing a crisis. And I'm going to try and show you scientifically that this just isn't true. And in fact, everything you've been told about climate science is upside down, back to front. They've got cause and effect the wrong way around. They've made a real hash of it, in fact. So who am I to be making such crazy claims? Well, I originally trained as an engineer, mechanical and production engineering, and then I had an injury at work, which meant I had to leave the shop floor, and I went to university, and I decided to do a degree in the history and philosophy of science. And it was a very interesting degree. It wasn't exactly a passport to a well-paid career, but it meant that I'll never be bored again, because there's so much to think about. It's something where you actually learn how to assess scientific theories, and you learn to go back to the original data. You find out where the data was collected. You find out how well these data sets have been put together and curated, who's in charge of them. How do you know if they're also theorizing using that data? How do you know that they haven't altered the data to fit their theory? And believe me, there's been quite a bit of that going on. And so one of the issues that we raised my original interest in climate science started in 1988, and that was the final year of my degree. And an American scientist called Jim Hansen stood up in front of the American Senate, and he gave a big presentation saying that our emission of carbon dioxide was going to raise the temperature and that this was dangerous, and that his projection was that it was going to cause inundations of low-lying land on the bordering the sea, and that the temperature was going to rise by several degrees, and all this. And I thought, wow, these are quite striking scientific claims. And I looked into it a bit at that time, and I thought, okay, so this is all resting on this greenhouse effect theory, and the model that they're using is really quite simplistic. It doesn't account for the complicated climate stuff like convection and all these things that go on in the real atmosphere. So they were just modeling an imaginary atmosphere to get these results. And so I kind of parked that on one side and got on with my life. But as the climate debate grew kind of more became into the media domain and started being pushed by the UN as being a major issue that the world had to deal with, and so they had to be given more power to deal with it, and so this whole idea of what we need is global governance is really predicated on this idea that it's a supranational problem that needs supranational solutions. And so this is where the whole kind of global governance thing really got going from the 1992 Rio conference and so on going forward. It's just ramped up, and we've had the conference of the parties every year, the COP. I think we're on COP 28 next, and they have these huge gab fests where thousands of people fly in, spewing CO2 into the sky from the aeroplanes they arrive on, and have a good jamboree for a couple of weeks, mostly talking about who's got the money and how much of it can we have. And actually, there was one official, Mr. Edenhofer, who said, actually, these conferences are no longer about the environment. They're about the de facto redistribution of the world's wealth. So just have a think about that for a moment, and also consider that now China is emitting 3 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as the rest of the developed countries combined. And this is because we've outsourced a lot of our industrial manufacture to China, and so they've become the kind of powerhouse of the world industrially. And so we haven't so much reduced our own emissions as just moved them elsewhere. We've moved them to China. And so, even if you accepted the IPCC's and the UN's argument that the emission of CO2 is a bad thing, then all of the so-called reductions that have been achieved in European countries and to some extent the US have been completely wiped out by the increase in emissions in China. And so if CO2 is a global problem and it spreads throughout the atmosphere globally, then whether it's being emitted in our countries or whether it's all being emitted from China makes no difference, does it? So the whole thing's a nonsense just in that respect. But what I'm going to talk about today will hopefully show you that actually CO2 isn't a problem at all. It's a beneficial, odorless, colourless trace gas making up 0.04% of the atmosphere. And we only we're only adding maybe 12% of that at most. And in fact, it doesn't have much of an effect on temperature, the Earth's temperature anyway, as I will go on to show you. So we really need to take the bull by the horns now and say, you've got the science wrong. And I'm going to show that using just one particular case study. We're going to look at how the amount of ice in the Arctic has been reducing over the last 40 years, and then take a look at where it's going next. So I'm going to try and move on to the next slide, because the polar bear, as you know, has become like the poster child of global warming. The poor old polar bear being made extinct by man's emissions. When Al Gore was a lad, there were about 7,000 polar bears. Now there are only about 30,000 left. So clearly there's a problem, and the problem is with the science. So let's take a look at some data. Sorry to start throwing graphs at you after lunch, but I'll try to, I won't involve any mathematics in this, or very, very little. But the green dots that you can see here on this graph are the data showing the amount of Arctic ice volume. So it's not just how many square miles it covers, but how thick it is as well. So it's actual measure of the volume of the ice. And it's what's called the anomaly. So for each month of the year, it says, well, there used to be this much ice in this month of the year, and how much is it going up or down? And as you can see, it's been going down. It's been going down since 1980, and it's gone down quite a lot. Whereas it used to be sort of 20 million cubic kilometers, it's now down to about 5. In the middle of summer, well, in September, when the ice reaches its minimum in the Arctic after it's had the sun shining on it 24/7 for the whole summer. So it looks pretty alarming, doesn't it? It's like a straight downward trend. It looks like we're actually going to hit zero around 2035, and in fact, that is what the latest papers from the IPCC tell us. That their projection is that we'll become ice-free in the Arctic in summer 2035. Now, you'll see this kind of, the projection runs in this band, and this band is plus or minus 2 standard deviations from this kind of central line. And you can see that about 89% of those data points fall within that. So it seems pretty convincing. It looks like a plausible kind of projection of the way things are going to go. But what I'm going to show you now is that there's another way to look at this data, the same data, where you'd reach quite a different conclusion. Again, plus or minus 2 standard deviations from this sinusoidal trend line. And this time, we've got 92% of the points fall within that band. So it's actually a slightly better correlation, if you like, than the linear projection from the IPCC. So why might it be a sinusoid like this? Why might it go down and then up again? Well, climate goes in cycles. If you look into the deep history of climate, going back, hundreds of thousands of years, you can see that there are many cycles in climate that are going on at all different sort of periodicities. And a major one is around this oscillation that you get of around 65 years in length. And that's been noticed, it's been measured since 1860, 1870. The ships that were doing trade, particularly in the Atlantic, they'd have the sailors throw a bucket over the side on a rope, get some water up, stick a thermometer in it, write down the measurement. And so since the 1860s, we've been getting data, and what they found was that the surface temperature of the Atlantic Ocean went up and down every 65 years or so. And this is called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. And in fact, back in I started a blog looking at climate science and other ideas about what might cause natural climate change back in 2009. And in 2011, somebody, persons unknown, put in the comments under one of the articles on my blog, they put a link to a Russian server which contained another tranche of the so-called ClimateGate emails. And the content of those was pretty eye-opening, because it showed what was going on behind the scenes, how the scientists were talking to each other about what was going on with the climate. And it didn't always square very well with what we were being told that the scientists were saying by the BBC and other media outlets. And so I started analysing some of these emails and writing articles about them. And somebody high up didn't like that at all. The government minister at the time, who was in the Lib Dem Conservative coalition, got a magistrate to issue a warrant. And on December the 11th, 2011, I had 5 officers turn up at my door to confiscate my computers using anti-terrorism legislation. I mean, this is, I thought I was involved in a scientific debate, but clearly it had become political. And just how political it was, I was to find out. Now, as it turned out, I had the last laugh on that because no action was taken against me, but the minister concerned went to prison for perverting the course of justice. So, so mentioning no names, Chris Hoon. So, you know, obviously there are powerful political forces behind all of this. Clearly there's a sort of industrial juggernaut with all the production of wind turbines and, you know, the massive amount of money that's involved there, and a lot of public money subsidizing those forms of energy production such as wind and solar. And so it becomes a legitimate question of public policy. How is our money being spent? Is it cost effective? Is it worth the candle? And, you know, what I'm going to show you is the answer to that is no, it's not. We're being ripped off. We're having our money stolen from us. We're being pushed into energy poverty, and a lot of old people who can't afford their fuel bills, that has, you know, deadly consequences for, because a lot of old folks die of hypothermia in the winter in this country. And I'll show you some stats later, but 10 times more people die of the cold than die of the heat worldwide. 2 million of them every year in Africa. You'd think was a warm continent, wouldn't you? But there's a fairly small number of people die of heat stroke in Africa every year, but nearly 2 million die of the cold every year. So could it be that we're seeing an oscillation? Well, one of those ClimateGate emails was from a scientist called Tommy Wills. And in his email, he asked a very pertinent question. He said, what if it all turns out to be a multi-decadal oscillation? They'll probably lynch us, right? Now, you know, they didn't like this dirty laundry coming out and being published on my blog, so that's why I had the cops round. But if we look at both of these together, these two possibilities for the future of the Arctic ice, you can see that over the last 40 years, the two possibilities have actually tracked each other quite closely. So it's, you know, both of these theories are plausible, if you like. You know, they both have quite a high percentage of correlation with the predictions that they make, but they're making opposite predictions. And you can see that those two bands will actually completely diverge in 2028, which is just a few years from now. And so if the data carries on down this slope, then it'll start to look more and more like the IPCC scientists are right, and I need to wind my neck in. But if it starts to go this way, and I would say to you that looking at the data at the moment, it does look like it's going this way, then they're going to have egg on their faces big time. And I think this is one of the reasons why they're pushing so hard at the moment to try and get all their global governance in place, to get everything imposed and to get people locked down under climate law, because they know that in another few years, if things start to go the other way, then they're going to not only look stupid, but we'll sack the lot of them, you know, which is what they deserve. So why am I confident about my prediction? Well, you remember me mentioning the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. Here it is. This is the AMO. And this date is all the way back to 1870. And you can see that it goes down, it goes up in the 1940s, it goes down again to the 1970s, and then it goes up again to now. And you can see we're just near the peak. And that if things go like they have done on the previous two cycles, it's going to start falling again in the next few years. And that's when we might see that Arctic ice starting to increase again. And as I showed in this slide with this trendline projection. So we'll find out. But at the moment, if you take that ice data, those green dots, and turn them the other way up so that it's sort of cold at the bottom and warm at the top to match the same as this graph, then you can see that the match is pretty good. The match is pretty good. So this is, to me, this looks like an indication that the actual natural cyclic climate change has been responsible for the change in the ice over the last 40 years, and that it's nothing to do with carbon dioxide in the air. It's everything to do with natural cycles that have been going on since time immemorial. And we know that they've been going on since time immemorial because of something called ice-rafted debris. Interesting scientific term. And what that means is when pebbles and stones from Greenland get trapped in the ice, and then the ice breaks off from the edge of the glacier and floats out into the Atlantic. When it gets far enough south to melt, it drops those stones and debris down onto the ocean floor. And we've actually had scientists who've gone and looked at where the edge, the southern edge of where these stones get dropped is, and they can tell from carbon dating some of the material like soil and so on that gets trapped in with those bits of stone. They can reconstruct a time series, and in fact they do get this 60-year cycle going on way back into the mists of time. So will it happen again? Very probably. So what caused the warming since 1980? I mean, this is kind of the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's the greenhouse effect, where sunlight comes in, warms the surface, and then the surface emits long-wave radiation that gets trapped by the carbon dioxide, and some of it's re-radiated back to the Earth, making it warmer. That's the theory. Or is it that the amount of cloud covering the Earth has changed? You can see here measurement of the total amount of cloud covering the Earth was fairly steady through the 1980s and 90s. And then about 95, it started to decline quite steeply. And then it stayed at a lower level. So the amount of cloud covering the Earth has actually gone down from about 63% to about 61%. And that 2% change, if it carried on long enough, would lead to around a 2-degree change in the surface temperature, because less clouds, more sunshine. Simple, isn't it? And to back up that idea, if you actually correlate the UK temperature with the number of sunshine hours observed in the UK, they match to 82%. Now, both of these data sets are on the Met Office's website, but you will never see the Met Office put both of those data sets on the same graph, for obvious reasons, because it supports the conclusion that it's actually changing cloud cover that's caused the warming of the Earth over the last 40 years, nothing to do with our emission of carbon dioxide. This shows the same thing, globally this time. So the blue line is the cloud dropping steeply in the 90s into the early 2000s and then staying at a lower level. And these dots are estimates of the amount of ocean heat content globally. And you can see that it rose fairly steadily and then reached this inflection point when the cloud amount dropped steeply. Then the amount of energy in the ocean started to rise steeply. And so that's what shows that we're actually caused by cloud cover, or the diminishing of cloud cover, not by emissions. Now, David told me I had about half an hour this time out. Is that 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. I'll rattle on, folks. So the models, the red line is an average of lots of model runs, shows the temperature soaring away, but the actual real-world measurements don't show anything like such a rise. So the models are over-egged, they're overheated. There are several reasons for that. Haven't got time now. These are newspaper cuttings from the 1860s saying that the temperature got to 105 Fahrenheit in New York, right? Well, that's over 40 degrees. So nothing particularly unusual or unprecedented about the 40 degrees that we had 2 years ago. Another clipping saying that 1,700 people died of heat stroke in one particular event in the States in the 1860s. And another one about fires in England, Cannock Chase, and the surrounding area. Wildfires are nothing new either. This shows the number of days in the year with a high temperature of over 95 Fahrenheit, heading up to about 38 centigrade. And you can see that there were more of them in the 1930s than there are now. So another thing to think about. And going back to what I was saying about cold and heat deaths, here are the figures, and it comes from The Lancet, which is a well-regarded scientific publication, showing that cold deaths far outweigh heat deaths all over the world, across all the continents. So we're quite right to question all of this, because the way it's been set up is we're being led by the IPCC scientists who claim that we can't ask questions and that we shouldn't challenge the science. And one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century, Richard Feynman, said, "I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." And this is critically important. And we've got to ask this question because all these scientists, since the Second World War, all the big science has been funded by government. And so what you end up with is policy-based evidence instead of evidence-based policy. Put more simply by our old friend young Linus here, who says, "Trust the science" is the most anti-science statement ever. Questioning the science is how you do science. Thank you very, very much for your attention this afternoon, folks. I hope I get a chance to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was amazing. Well done. That was amazing. Well done. Wow.